Okay, British and American culture class. Welcome to another lecture. I found my button. That's good. But I don't have any other good announcements. Particularly, we ran the quiz today and unsuccessfully. So at 12:30, I got 25 emails and screenshots. All I can say is it was a technical mistake. I pasted the wrong form link into the Cyber Campus, so you were sent to a form that was already closed instead of the correct one. I checked this morning to make sure everything was okay, and I just don't know how I mixed up the quizzes from other ones, but the good news is everybody missed the quiz, and I'm sorry if that caused you some anxiety before you got the messages. I sent an email and a text message to everyone. So that's what happened. Nobody got access to the quiz, so it's still there. Just the form limiter wasn't set, so it was already closed. The form limiter on the quiz you were supposed to write worked, but nobody had the link. So nobody wrote it. So we'll decide on Friday what we're going to do about that. We could do it on Friday, or we could do it next Wednesday. I know you prepared for the quiz, but we all know that it's not going to be graded. It's just a test. So at least I made that mistake on a mock test, not on a real one, and we can move on. So today, I'm going to talk about medieval life. Sometimes that expression isn't fashionable anymore to call it medieval, but I like it because when I was young, I think there still is a show in Toronto, in Canada, called The Medieval Times, Dinner and Tournament. And you go there and you sit in sort of rows in an arena, and in front of you there's knights wearing armor, and they have their crests, their heraldry, their shields and their swords and everything. And I think there's usually 4 knights. There's like a blue knight, a yellow one, a red one, and a green one. And your section cheers for your knight. And they do this just to replicate medieval life. In the textbook, this is chapter 2, following the section on, there it is, the section on the Normans. Just to remind you about what the Normans are like, they're basically a group of Vikings who are allowed to settle in northern France, which is called Normandy after them. And they gradually started to mix with French culture and French people. So they remained Normans until France sort of absorbed Normandy hundreds of years later from the English king. Because as you know, the Duke of Normandy is now the King of England too, and they will lose control of Normandy eventually, but for several hundred years, that's the same person. So the English king has lands in Normandy. It kind of gets reabsorbed several times before it finally gets lost for good to the French king. For them, religion is important because the Normans become Christian, but the way that they interpret their religion has to be different because they're very violent people. We talked about William the Conqueror and the things that he did, the harrying of the north. When the English rebelled against him, he took his army and he rode across the countryside, burning and killing everything until they behaved themselves. This was okay in his version of Christianity. Part of what's going to help drive this new version of Christianity, which is much more violent and militant, is the Crusades. I won't get ahead of myself and talk about it yet, but the Crusades start at the end of William the Conqueror's reign, which is around 1087, I think, and they continue for several hundred years. Although the First Crusade is the most successful one, and the Third Crusade, which we'll talk about later, is the only other one that's really does anything significant in what they call the Holy Lands, or Ultramar, which means over the ocean. So this is an interesting thing. It changes everything as far as religious things are concerned, because basically the church preaches that you should be a pacifist like Jesus Christ, because he's the model Christian person, obviously. And Jesus Christ was not a warrior, right? But they come up with these new ways of interpreting Christianity, that you can represent Christianity by being a soldier, a warrior for God, or a warrior of Jesus Christ, right? And the Crusaders did something they call taking up the cross, taking the cross, and there's a red cross. If you see any armor in museums, or you watch movies, or you read books and you see images, those crusading knights, mostly from France, but of course many from England and Germany and the Low Countries too, they will be wearing that red cross as a symbol to their commitment to the fight. Now, we do have a lot of students from different places in the world and religions, so I'm not promoting crusading. I think it's not the right term to use in many situations, but I am actually talking about the Crusades, so that's why I'm using the term. Those people were crusaders that took up the cross for a certain reason. The princes, whether you're a king or an emperor, or you're the leader of the Christian church, a pope, those people were referred to as princes. They're royalty, and they're at the top of the chain of being. We talked about the chain of being last lecture. So at the very top, you have princes, and below them you have dukes and earls in England. Those words come from Viking language, a jarl, and duke comes via France and Latin. And so you would have a duchy if you're a duke, and you'd have an earldom if you're an earl, which is kind of like a smaller version of the kingdom that a king has. And then you have like counts and lords and lesser gentry under them. All these people, you would call them gentlemen. At a certain point, they're going to become that. But during this time, after William the Conqueror, one of the reasons we call it the High Middle Ages, or the medieval period, is because it's violent and brutal, and the upper class become knights. And so they wear armor, and they have swords, and they ride horses. And this is going to be the upper class's job, to lead men into battle on horse. And horses are expensive, but you needed not just one horse, you need several horses, and you need a suit of armor that's custom made for yourself, usually made of chain links, we call it chainmail, and a helmet and a sword, and eventually a lance. They'll be charging with lances, which will impact somebody else and knock them off their horse. William the Conqueror, from the tapestry we can see, called the Bayeux Tapestry, of the battle between him and King Harold, in which Harold gets the arrow supposedly shot into his eye, you can see the Normans are basically just using spears and have light armor, and they're riding horses. 200 years later, when the period fully develops its method of warfare, you could probably compare the men wearing armor and riding. These are big horses, not like your fancy upper class riding horse, like not an Arabian horse, but one of these big, huge, like, they'd be 400 or 500 kilogram, like a Clydesdale or something. I don't know if you know what that is. It's a really big, strong horse. They were called them war horses, and they were strong enough to wear armor themselves eventually. So you can imagine that if you were going to fight one of these guys who had been fighting his entire life and was mounted on a huge animal covered in metal, that was kind of like fighting a tank. If you had a knife or a spear or a pitchfork or even an axe or a sword, what are you supposed to do against something like that coming across field at you? The horse is going to probably step on you and break your bones, and then the knight is going to run over top of you and swing his weapons down at you as he goes by. There's nothing really you can do about it. Same way that we would have problems standing up to a tank. If you just had a regular gun, even a machine gun, a tank would just come forward and roll over you or fire its gun, and that it would be very difficult to fight back. So these are like medieval tanks, these knights. Related to religion is a very important word. Heresy is a term that's used for different versions or new sects or cults of religious people, religious ideas that are not accepted by the church. So England was relatively free of heresy, but there's heresy everywhere. The Catholic Church tries to keep its power contained, tries to keep an order and the rules that everybody has to follow. This is the way you're supposed to read the Bible. This is what it means. These are the rules you have to follow. And some people reinterpret or have different ideas about what the church means and what the Bible means. And they become, if the church decides that they have broken away too far from the core religion that the Catholic Church possesses, they can be branded a heresy. Now, England doesn't have heresies for the most part. They happen in Egypt, they happen in Africa, they happen in Syria, in France. There's a bunch of heresies over the years, but it doesn't happen until the very end of the medieval period that a heresy, technically a heresy, develops in England. And we have to talk about that on Friday as well, because that's in the future. But there are different versions of Christianity across Europe. The Catholic Church is the official, most powerful one, but you have the Orthodox Christians in the East, the Greek Orthodox, and later there's going to be a Russian Orthodox Church. So there's Eastern Orthodox, and then there's Catholic, and then there's some blended different types of Christianity in the West. So it's not like all religion is the same and practiced the same in every country. Ireland is going to be Catholic, and their version of Catholicism and the way the Easter, for example, is celebrated on a different day in the Irish Catholic Church than it was by the Italian Catholic Church under the Pope. So like when Irish people intermarried with English people, the English people had to decide, am I going to follow my wife's Easter calendar, or am I going to follow my own? So all of these kind of blending things happened across Europe, and it certainly happened in the British Isles too. Part of the thing about English identity, which will help form the British identity later, is that they're constantly trying to have it the English way. They're trying to run their kingdom and practice their religion in a way that gives them some control over England. So there's a lot of conflicts between popes and bishops and the King of England, because the King of England is constantly trying to control the church in England, and the Pope may not want to do that. He wants to have the power to choose the high priests and the archbishops, and he wants to be able to take taxes from the church lands and stuff like that. As I told you before, Normandy was under the thumb of the church, but once William becomes King of England, he basically supports the church, and the church gets all of its money and land from him, right? But gradually the Pope is going to become more important, and sometimes you have a better Pope, a stronger Pope, and sometimes you have a weaker one, so they may or not come to have a conflict between the King of England and the Pope. But there's certainly the King of France has his problems with the Pope, and the Pope is always arguing, should we be following French interests or the interests of the Catholic Church? Which one's more important? As you will see, the English are going to eventually decide that the English identity is more important than their Christian identity or their European identity. And that's a sort of distinctive thing about the British Isles. Still part of the church, Christian church, but starting to be able to have its own, pull the strings from the king's perspective instead of the Pope's. So that's what heresy is. Doesn't happen in England until later, so we'll leave it until we finish this chapter, and I'll come back to heresy. I don't want to tell you all about every king. And there's a lot of Henrys, there's 8 of them, and there's a lot of Edwards. I think by the end of this course, there's 8 or 9 Edwards. And the Henrys and Edwards are the most important ones in this period, but I don't want to get you confused. So we'll just stick to, we'll jump over the first Henry, because I don't want to take too much time trying to help you remember the difference between Henry the First and Henry the Second. So we'll just skip over Henry the First, okay? But Henry the Second is not Henry the First's son. So it goes William, and then William has a son called William the Second, and he dies, and his brother is Henry the First. And Henry the First, he doesn't have any sons, so he ends up with son-in-law and his daughter being sort of in line for the throne. But nobody wants a queen, so the English barons and the English people sort of don't accept Matilda, Queen Matilda, as their queen. So she negotiates to have her son, which would be Henry the First's grandson, who is also named Henry, become the next king. So when Henry the First dies, and her cousin Stephen, who is King Stephen, he dies, then it jumps over her and her husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, another French guy, who was constantly fighting for things in France on the behalf of the English and on his own behalf. And it skips over to Henry II. One of the reasons Henry II is so important is because he had a massive personality, and he was married to a woman who had a massive personality too. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Not only did she have a massive personality, but she was politically savvy, and she was intelligent, and she was culturally developed. She was into all kinds of things like fashion, poetry, music, pageantry, beautiful clothes, beautiful decorations. She was married to the King of France, and then she got divorced, and she had her own property because she didn't have a brother. So Eleanor of Aquitaine, when she remarried the King of England, we get another reason for the kings of France and the kings of England to have disagreements, because when Eleanor of Aquitaine marries Henry II, Henry II has Anjou from his father, and he has Normandy from his grandfather. And now when he marries Eleanor, he gets this huge chunk called Aquitaine, which is like northwestern France is northwest France, northeast to western France is a big, long, continuous line of land. Anjou, Aquitaine, and Normandy, and there's another place called Poitiers in there. These lands they belong to the English king, not the French king. So as the Duke of Normandy, the King of England is actually under the King of France, which is going to create another problem with the chain of being, right? Because who is supposed to be under whose power? Well, the Duke of Normandy owes allegiance to the King of France, right? So technically the King of England is a vassal of the King of France, right? So they're equal because they're both kings. And Henry II, he also goes to Ireland. So then he takes over Ireland also. So he's got England, Wales, Ireland, Anjou, Normandy. You don't have to remember all this, but they call this as a result the Angevin Empire. And Henry II's mother, Matilda, who was passed over as queen because she was not a man, although seems like she would have made a good king if she was a guy, or she would have made a great queen if they just let her do it. But it was not a popular decision, so she didn't get a chance to rule. But his mother is Matilda, and she was married to the Holy Roman Emperor before he passed away. And so when she came back and married Geoffrey of Anjou and had kids, she was the Empress of Germany before. So Henry II's got, his great-grandfather is William the Conqueror. His grandfather is Henry I. And his father and mother are Matilda, the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, then the Queen of England, and his father is a very important French noble named Geoffrey of Anjou. So they've got this pedigree, right? At this point, the Angevin Empire is bigger than France. Um, the British Isles are mostly united, and Henry II is very, very active. He's very busy. He's a very good general. He's good at leading soldiers. He's good at fighting. He moves very quickly. He's in Ireland, and then he's at northern England, then he's in Wales, then he's in Normandy, then he's in Anjou. The King of France, who is the ex-husband of his wife, even though Eleanor, when she married Henry II, she was like 8 years older than him. I think she was 30 when he was 20, 22. So he was your age and he married a woman 8 years older than him. That's a very uncommon thing in those days because, the king wanted to have children, but that was not a problem. Even though she was already older, she might have been 28 and he was 20. I have to look it up. There's a big age gap there, and she's almost 30 years old, and she has many kids. She manages to have 5 sons, 4 of whom become adults. So she's got this big group, and she's got a couple daughters too. So they have 7 or 8 children. So she's good at everything. She's good at having children. She's good at appreciating culture. She's rich. She's powerful. Henry II, though, has also a very big personality, and they just can't get along very well. They seem to have gotten along as like a power couple, you might say, just like Brangelina was, like Brad Pitt plus Angelina Jolie. They had lots of kids, and they looked like a great couple. Everybody celebrated them, but they couldn't, after a certain amount of time, their personalities couldn't resolve their differences, and they had to separate. Basically, that's what happens to Eleanor. She basically interferes with his business with his sons. She has her favorites. She loves John, and she loves Richard. These are the 2 guys on the board, and they both get to be kings later. But her favorite is John for some reason. But their family is pretty dysfunctional. So they're fighting each other. Eventually it gets to the point where Henry II is fighting his own sons, and he's too old and sick and tired that he has to surrender, and he dies, and then Richard the Lionheart becomes king. That's why he's so important, is because he made this huge area that was a big chunk of France, and he invaded Ireland too, and he was very, very busy. He reformed the English justice system. And this stuff is not in the textbook, so I hope you listen to this carefully. Let me just remind you, this is supposed to be in the next edition. This will be between Magna Carta and the Crusade part. Actually, it will be before the Crusades, between medieval life and Crusades. Anyways, in this chapter, this information I'm telling you is supposed to go in the next edition of this book, which will hopefully be this summer. The other thing that Henry II did, it did many things, very busy, and he was king for a long time because he became king when he was young. So he was ruling for over 30 years. So there was a lot of his influences everywhere. He made friends with this guy named Thomas Becket, who was a very charismatic, good-looking, well-spoken, but not high-born, not a upper-class wealthy person, not a baron, or a prince, or a count, or anything like that. He made his way up by being a court favorite, but certainly lesser gentry. He didn't like being called Thomas of Becket. His last name was sort of related to the fact that he wasn't a noble, and he doesn't have this pedigree like Henry. But he loves hunting, and he loves partying, and he gets along really well with Henry. So when the Archbishop of Canterbury dies, Henry thinks it's a good idea to get his buddy, his friend, Thomas, to become the next archbishop. So sometimes, whoops, my stand just fell over. Okay, hopefully it won't move. It's cutting off my head. Hold on a second. This has been quite the day for mishaps. Okay. I'm not going to edit that. We'll just keep going. This has been quite the Wednesday, like I said. what was I saying? Henry II, he was thinking that when he appointed Becket to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, then he would be able to control him. And he would be his man, right? Of course, he raised him up to that level. He couldn't do that by himself. The king promoted him, and he became part of his retinue and became his friend. And then he promoted him again to the highest position he could get in the church. But when Thomas Becket became Archbishop of Canterbury, he sort of took the job seriously. You might say, in Henry's opinion, too seriously. So whenever they were arguing about control of this amount of money or this court, or whether somebody should be appointed by the Pope or by the Archbishop, or he should, King Henry II should have the ability to appoint the position of the people himself, as he did with Becket himself. Thomas did everything to keep the power in the church's hands, which this drove Henry II crazy. And he had some weird habits, like he used to get so worked up and angry that he would just lay down on the ground and bite the carpet. They didn't really have carpets, they were like rushes. American history professor told me this story, and I just think it's great because it illustrates how frustrated and angry Henry usually was. So when people saw him behaving like that, they tried to calm him down or tried to get him what he wants. This is how he would show people he was really, really upset. Lay down on the ground and bite the floor. I don't know. It's a different culture. I'm not a 12th century Englishman, so I don't know how this works. But he would show his anger by yelling or biting the carpet or something, or having sort of a tantrum. And in one of these cases, him and Thomas Becket tried to patch up their differences, but there was such animosity between the two of them that Becket had to leave the country for 5 years, and then he came back, and he thought things had been fixed between him and the king, but they were not. And so the king, supposedly, king said one day, I can't deal with this anymore. Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? Will no one get rid of this guy for me? And 4 of his knights were like, did he say that? Let's do that. Let's take care of it. They didn't ask him. They just went. And they're gonna, I think the goal was to kidnap him or scare him. But when they went to the cathedral at Canterbury, they found Becket praying in the sanctuary at the front. And he refused to leave. So these guys are like trying to pull him out, and he refused to go with them. So one of them said, well, fine, then we're just gonna get rid of you right now. And he swung a sword and chopped part of his head off right there, right in the middle of and so the archbishop falls to the ground, bleeding to death, and these 4 knights run away. And this murder shocks everyone so much that Henry II actually has to pay penance. He gets whipped by some churchmen as punishment, because a lot of the public, a lot of the English and the Christians believe that he is responsible. He was the one who, he didn't technically order his men to kill him, certainly not in a cathedral, but because of his behavior and what he said, there was a murder inside a cathedral, and that's going too far. So Henry II has to have punishment for that, and he has to sort of compensate the church for that. And Thomas Becket becomes a saint very quickly. Sometimes people die and they become saints in the Catholic Church. It could be 100 years later. It's normally not a few years later. But Becket was, you might even sort of call him the first English celebrity. I've heard other professors make that point, that he was so popular and everybody wanted to visit his bones and his tomb, that they created a shrine, right? The shrine to St. Thomas of Becket, and people would visit there. And we're going to talk about Chaucer and Shakespeare and stuff later, and Canterbury is going to be that's the seat of religious power, that's the seat of religious authority in England for the next 400 years. And it's still going to mean so much. Canterbury is going to mean so much. And the Shrine of Becket is going to be so important that Henry VIII is going to destroy it. As he doesn't want English people traveling to Canterbury and praying in front of the Shrine of Becket. So when he creates the Church of England, Henry VIII is going to get rid of it because he doesn't want that symbol of Catholic power and English Christian dedication to somebody else. He likes people to be dedicated to him completely, and he was going to be the head of the English Church. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's hundreds of years later. So during this whole period, from when Thomas Becket dies, he's murdered, from then, throughout the next period until Shakespeare is born and Henry VIII is alive and Queen Elizabeth and all that stuff, from now until then, this Canterbury is going to be the most important religious place. And even after that, it will remain important. But the Shrine of Becket will be destroyed by Henry VIII. Okay, so that's Henry II. What else can I say? His children, the one that inherits the throne when he dies is Richard the Lionheart. This is in the book. So when you look at the Crusades there, in the textbook, it explains what I said, how it's becoming a military, violent sort of society based on these popes sort of shift the idea that you can fight for your religion. That's a possibility. Pope Urban II is the one who asked people to take up the cross. He does this famous sermon in France, and he summons all of the warriors of Christ to go to the Holy Land and take back Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was taken over by Muslim armies, and the Byzantine army is unable to, it's not powerful enough anymore to fight against their armies. So they're going to make this mission. They're going to go on this quest, which they call a crusade because they take up a cross, and they're going to load up ships full of equipment and men and go down there and attempt this. And it's a very unexpected event, and even though the first one is very successful and they take Jerusalem back, all the crusades after that don't live up to that first crusade achievement. So they will lose Jerusalem, and Richard will go on the third crusade, along with King Philip of France and other nobles, another powerful army, the third one. It's difficult to number these crusades sometimes because some of them did things and some of them didn't really do things because there was all sorts of things like disease and ships and logistics you had to worry about. But Richard the Lionheart is he's idealized, right? And you may know him from the Robin Hood story, but that's not correct. Robin Hood didn't live during Richard's lifetime. Robin Hood is a story that's told later, and there's a Scottish historian that will push Robin Hood back in time to the time of Richard the Lionheart when he goes on crusade, and put Robin as a hero against Prince John before his brother dies and he becomes king. The wicked Prince John. John becomes, after you'll see what I mean, he becomes a notorious figure because he's very strongly disliked. Let's put it that way. People don't like him as a king at all. So that's why there's only one John. There's only one Stephen. He was not popular either. John, there's only one because he was not popular with the English barons or the people. Richard was, though. And this is even though Richard is outside of England almost the entire time he's alive. He rarely comes back to England. He's in France. He's fighting his father at the beginning. Then he's fighting other various factions, rebellious nobles. And then he's in the Crusades. And then he tries to come home. And he gets kidnapped and he gets ransomed. And then he gets shot with a crossbow, which the wound gets infected, and then he dies. He's spectacularly eventful during his life, but he doesn't live that long. He does get married, but he has no children. but he embodied all of the things that King Arthur had, right? He was religious, he was a great warrior, he was tall, he was handsome, he was powerful, he liked music and poetry and stories, he liked romances, he was chivalrous, he could ride a horse, he could hunt. Right? This is very kingly, sort of king type person in this. That's what you want. You want somebody like Richard the Lionheart. And he's called the Lionheart because he's brave. He fights in the Crusades, and he fights successfully to get close to Jerusalem, but he fails to take it because there's a Muslim general who's as good as he is, as powerful and intelligent and strong and chivalrous. He has a sense of honor. In English we call him Saladin, but he has another name. He's a Kurdish person, but he became the leader of Egypt. He became the Caliph of Egypt, and then he led the armies, the Islamic armies that fought against Richard. And they basically fought each other to a standstill, and they formed some peace agreements. Richard won some battles, Saladin won some other ones, and he prevented Richard from taking Jerusalem. And then Richard decided it was time to return to his lands in France and England. So he left after reconquering some parts of Palestine, but really without the main goal, which was to take Jerusalem back. But that will not happen. Jerusalem will be under Muslim control until after World War II. So for the next 700 years or so, it'll be part of Muslim territory. We don't need to go there either, because that's not the point of me emphasizing Richard here. The point is, Richard met his match. He met his match, another capable general, but he was kind of the opposite of him in some ways, but also very similar in some ways, right? It was his counterpart, almost like he was fighting a brother. Anyway, he returns, like I said, and he has some misadventures, and he gets captured by the emperor of the Holy Empire in Germany, or Bohemia. He gets captured and gets pushed around, and then he gets ransomed. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, has to pay a huge amount of money to get him back, and as soon as they get him back, he's fighting in northern France, and he gets shot by a crossbow bolt, and then he dies. So he never gets to really settle down in England or France into any sort of stable state. When he dies, his younger brother John ascends to the throne. One more thing. Richard had a sword. The sword's name was Excalibur, because he believed he was a sort of reincarnation of King Arthur. So in the story of King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, the sword and the stone, and all that stuff, that sword is called Excalibur, and that's the sword, that was the name for Richard's sword. So he really did consider himself to be sort of a, real life representation of King Arthur. King John's problem is he's a selfish, voracious, he's a bad man. He's a bad man. He treats everyone as if they're way lower on the chain than him. He doesn't show respect for his barons, his lords, earls. He disrespects them by sexually assaulting some of his wealthy barons' wives or sisters or mothers or that sort of thing. So he's very unpopular with the wealthy people in England, and because he's trying to fight these wars against King Philip of France, he needs to tax people a lot. So English people detest taxes, like everybody. Especially English people don't like being taxed. And if they don't know where it's going, and if it's not doing anything, it makes them even angrier. King John, unlike Richard, was not successful. He tried to fight against Philip in France, and Philip was a far better general than him. So he lost most of the land that he inherited from Richard and from Henry and Eleanor. Almost all of the land in France gets taken back. There's only like Poitiers remaining. And he spends a lot of money. It's very expensive, and there's no victories. So he's very unpopular. In 1215, in Runnymede, it's power sharing with the people, page 73 that I'm talking about. They made him sit down, King John, they made him sit down with the barons, and then they wrote out this great charter, it's called, which basically said that just because you're chosen by God, you still have your divine right, and everybody has to listen to you, but you're not above the law. You can't infringe on other people's law, and you have to consult your barons. You can't just do things, you can't just put taxes on everybody. There's a limit to your royal power. And John hated this because he thought his power was unlimited, and he was an absolute king, and that nothing should check his behavior. And so he doesn't. He writes down, he signs the charter, and then immediately a year later, he's saying, I didn't want to sign that. I didn't believe it. They forced me to do it. It doesn't count. And the Pope is also a prince. He's gonna agree with them and say that the Magna Carta is not a legal document, right? However, it turns out that this document becomes more important later because it doesn't really give Parliament power. It doesn't really give anybody more power except for the rich, the barons, right? So the dukes and the earls and stuff, they're going to look at the king as like a leader among them, but they're just the lesser of two equals. Not just the king is far above them and he can do whatever he wants to them, because that was the problem. He was actually personally insulting his barons by stealing their women and taking their money. And he's not going to be able to do that under Magna Carta. He continues to do it though, and so he remains unpopular, and then he dies. When he dies, the Great Charter will be renewed by his son, and it'll be pretty much renewed constantly over the next few hundred years. So the importance of this at the time is very low, except to the barons. The barons really want it, but it really doesn't do anything for the average English person. It's only years and years later that people will look back to Magna Carta as the beginning of sharing power with the people. That's why that's the name of that section, okay? So just read that over, that power sharing with the people part. And Parliament, right? Parliament is going to become the representative body of the people, not the king. And they're going to argue that they're supposed to be in power, that this is a tradition that goes back through Magna Carta all the way to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. When the king decided to listen to his barons, right? The king would summon his barons to parler, right? To talk. That's what a parliament means. So they would come when the king invited them. Parliament didn't exist as a governmental body. It was summoned there by the king. So sharing the power and telling them that he needs money to do things is part of this relationship. And basically, Parliament is going to become more and more powerful because after Magna Carta is reissued and Parliament becomes more and more necessary for the king to understand what's going on and to collect money and to fight for fighting wars and protecting his power in the kingdom. As that happens, Parliament is going to get stronger and stronger because all of the kings and queens, basically in English history, especially when they have a war, they need money. And the way they get money is by summoning the barons, the important people of the realm. Parliament starts to become actually a sort of a right. Like if you're an earl and your father was an earl and your grandfather was an earl, you automatically get to come. And that's where this House of Lords, right, becomes part of the English system, right? Now that's actually just a symbolic thing, but this became really important. Like if you were the son of a great lord, you were automatically given a seat. You were automatically part of the peerage, right? And peers means they're the same level. And the king, he interacts with the lords and he needs their approval for things. So it's the king comes down to within, sort of earthly range of the upper class people. Although the vast majority of English people still don't have any ability to affect the government and how the kingdom is ruled. They won't have that power for a long time. But this is the start of the process. So looking back, Magna Carta becomes one of the most important things in English history. So now you have two dates to remember: Magna Carta 1215 and William the Conqueror 1066, Battle of Hastings, right? There'll be a few numbers like this. Like I said, this is number 2. Let's don't forget, 1215, John was forced to agree to follow the law and respect his barons. And that was the beginning of the process of sharing power with the English people. That's where I'm going to stop today. And we'll pick up, we'll skip over a few things. We'll pick up later talking about the 14th century and all the disasters that happened, and the good things and bad things about the end of the Middle Ages, right? The 14th century, you've got basically the Italian Renaissance is in full swing, but in England, in Spain and France, for the most part, people are still in the medieval age. We're not into the Renaissance yet. English Renaissance is going to come really late. Part of the reason for that is because of the disasters in food production and the disease called the Black Death. So, sorry for all the mishaps, technical mishaps, including the phone falling over in the middle of the lecture, but hopefully you can just skip over that, just skip ahead a couple 15 or 20 seconds and continue with your lecture, and we'll figure out when we're going to reschedule the mock quiz on Friday. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.